the rise of terrestrial forms began on Friday. But let's pick it up where we left off. So we had seen the radiation, first, well, the colonization of land on the part of amphibian-grade organisms first. So creatures that are not necessarily more closely related to frogs and salamanders and toads than they are to you and I and dinosaurs, but that have a tadpole-like, an aquatic early stage and then a terrestrial adult stage. And then towards the end of the last lecture, I got to this huge transition, this really important change in the history of life, and that was the evolution of the amniotic egg, so that organisms could spend their entire life cycle on land, and that broke them free from the ponds. Not to say some of them don't still hang out near ponds or anything, but it opened up a big world for them. And that allowed the amniotes, the group that have this egg or that are descended from it, to undergo an adaptive radiation, or in fact, undergo the first of several adaptive radiations. And so I finished last time with the first amniotic adaptive radiation, the basal synapsids, the earliest members of our own particular lineage. This is a case where that adaptive radiation comes to an end because they basically evolved themselves out of existence. They produced out of this group of basal forms, a derived group, and we see a large representative of the derived group looking at some of the more primitive, earlier branches below, and quickly take over the world in the mid-Permian. So this next, just to mention again, this fin-backed form is closer to you and I, and cats and dogs, and kangaroos, and the duck-billed platypus than it is to lizard snakes, turtles, crocodilians, birds, and dinosaurs, and birds and other dinosaurs. So this next radiation is the radiation of the therapsid synapses. So again, these are not reptiles in any cladistic sense. They might have been traditionally called mammal-like reptiles, but first of all, they're not reptiles because they're not part of this radiation, this clade that's lizard snakes, turtles, crocodilians, birds, and all their extinct relatives. But rather, they're proto-mammals. They're a group out of which mammals, including us, ultimately evolved. And they're not mammal-like. We are therapsids. So we have inherited their traits. It's not that they are similar to us. We are part of them. So this is this big radiation in the middle and late parts of the Permian. So, and in this form, this is the first community of organisms that really gets the style of ecosystem that we're used to in the terrestrial communities of the world today, where most of the energy of the environment comes from plants. Remember I mentioned the basal synapsid communities, a lot of them were eating aquatic food, and so there were lots of parts of that trophic radiation, or the trophic levels that were in the streams and the ponds, and then some of the terrestrial forms were eating fish and so forth. There were a few herbivores, but not as many. Now we get something that looks like a modern ecological community. Lots of plants, a big diversity of herbivores, and then second and third order consumers eating them. Now what makes a therapsid distinct from earlier synapsids? Well, they retain that intratemporal fenestra, but now that infratemporal fenestra, that jaw opening, becomes even larger, becomes much, much bigger. Also, whereas something like Dimetrodon or Adaptations or the other basal synapsids tended to have forelimbs, or front limbs and hind limbs that were about equally well developed, which is sort of the ancestral condition. In therapsids, they have enlarged forelimbs and enlarged pectoral girdles. There was a paleontologist in the 20th century at the Smithsonian who said these guys have front-wheel drive. So more of the powers up front. That's one of the traits that we've inherited from them. Most mammals tend to have more powerfully developed forelimbs than hind limbs. Take a look at a horse. Take a look at an elephant. Take a look at a gorilla. Sort of an extreme version, but there it is. A bat, a really extreme version. It's rare, in fact, for something like a kangaroo or a jerboa, where the hind limbs are more developed than the forelimbs. Also, so here you have expanded infratemporal fenestra again, we start to get fully differentiated teeth. technical term, oh, we'll go to the technical term for here. Heterodonty, if you can. But we start to get teeth of an entirely different shape in different parts of the jaw. We saw Dimetrodon, that most advanced of the basal synapsids, was beginning to show that. These guys, they haven't fully developed, and we've inherited this from them. So we've got nipping incisors up front in the premaxillae. At the front of the maxilla, we've got canines for biting. And behind that, cheek teeth for grinding. And that's what we've got in our mouths. We still have incisors, we have canines, and in the case of us mammals, we've separated the cheek teeth into a couple different sorts. Premolars up front, molars up back, but they're still grinding cheek teeth. Now these therapsid synapsids, it wasn't adaptive radiation, so they lived in many different ways. So some were predators. There's Titanophonius, a sort of a lion-sized predator of the Permian. Here's even larger, Archosaurus, something almost the size of an ox. Let's see. There were smaller predators too. Lycanops is about the size of a wolf, maybe, between a coyote and a wolf. Probably gives you a sense of the size. Inosphensidia, the largest of the Permian predators. Again, about the size of an ox, but with this really powerful saber teeth-like jaws. This is sort of the first version of saber teeth to show up. Various sorts of mammals, including most famously the saber-toothed cats, would re-evolve that later on. And this critter is almost inevitably shown attacking a giant reptile, a giant sauropsid that lived in the same community as it. So that's what you see going on here. But not all these guys were carnivores. There were herbivores. So moscops shown. Okay, this would be bigger than life size, but not tremendously bigger than life size as shown. So an ox-sized herbivore. Again, this one you can really see these powerful front legs compared to the hind legs. So it's almost like if you've ever seen the old Warner Brother cartoons where they would have a bulldog, and the bulldog has gigantic front legs, these tiny little hind legs behind it, almost like that. And here we see it going on. And actually, this group to which this belongs is characterized by very thick skulls, which were probably used in bouts of competition. So you see some of them smashing their heads together here. We will see that happen in the dinosaurs later on, convergently. These guys are, again, they're actually looking at this big armored early reptile over here, another herbivore in their same environment. These guys down here are also therapsids, little burrowing guys, early representatives of a diverse group. Some of that group to which those little burrowers belong were among the first climbing herbivores. So this is a little animal, squirrel-sized animal. It's a synapsid, it's a therapsid synapsid. One of the first things to be a tree-dwelling herbivore. And here we have an example of it looking down at one of its predatory cousins. This is a close relative of that form that was burrowing. And in fact, Listersaurus here shows up right before the tail end of the Permian, and its main claim to fame is that it's going to make it through to the Triassic, where very few things do, as we'll see. So among the more advanced therapsids, these dicynodonts down at the bottom, that's the group with the burrower and Listersaurus. They're two-tusked animals. They're the only teeth they have are these two tusks. And they include herbivores and omnivores. Dicynodonts make it into the Triassic. They'll be important then too. And this group above, the cynodonts. Cynodonts include some herbivores and some omnivores and some carnivores with very mammal-like teeth. Well, they ought to have it because we, as mammals, are cynodonts as well. That name, by the way, means dog tooth. And here we see a cynodont about to feast on a dicynodont. Now they're shown with fur. We honestly do not know exactly when fur evolved in therapsid history. There are some coprolites from the Permian that show what have been interpreted as some fur in it. But it's not entirely certain that's what they are, and we have never found a lake deposit or a lagoon deposit with these therapsids in it, so we know what's exactly on the outside of their bodies. We are hoping to find something like that someday. There is evidence among early therapsids that they may have indeed been furry. For instance, people look at pits on the front of the snout of some of these things, and think that they are associated with the muscles involved with whiskers, although it's not universally recognized, and there's other alternatives. One thing that is of interest is that among the derived cynodonts, we get the ribs stopping partway down the dorsals. In fact, they're no longer dorsals. We call them thoracics and lumbars, which is what we have, another mammal-like trait. And the reason that we mammals have this division, and we'll talk about this in the third section of the course, is we have a diaphragm. We breathe with a diaphragm, whereas early amniotes, including early synapsids, didn't. So this thing could breathe with a much greater, what we call tidal volume, more air coming in, more air going out, like we do, suggesting it had an elevated metabolism, suggesting perhaps it was warm-blooded. And in fact, we find creatures like this in the polar regions of the Permian. When it might not have been as cold as it is today in the polar regions, but still it was pretty darn cold. Yet more evidence that some of these, at least, may have been warm-blooded. But this is not a course on therapsids. This is a course on dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are members of Saropsida. So Saropsida, reptilia in a cladistic sense, but because reptilia comes with a lot of baggage, like I said, people used to call therapsids mammal-like reptiles when they use them paraphyletically. I'm going to try to use Saropsida for the clade. And some of the things that make reptiles don't actually preserve in the fossil record. Things like really aglandular skin lacking in glands. Our skin, we've got lots of sweat glands. In the frogs and salamanders and so forth, they got mucus glands. Fish have a lot of mucus glands. The skin of most sauropsids is dry. It doesn't have glands in it, and the type of keratin on it is a different sort of keratin that we have. It's called beta keratin. Also, the kidneys of sauropsids are specialized. Instead of leaking, instead of only producing liquid urine, they can package up their nitrogenous wastes as this whitish powder. Because of this reason, I don't have to change out my lizard's cages, the bottom of it, anywhere near as often as if I had a comparable sized mammal, like a ferret or what have you, because they're not leaking all the time. They're packaging it up in a drier form. Or when a bird craps on your head and you see all that white stuff on you, it didn't crap on you, it peed on you. But it's not actually a liquid pee anymore. Also, the eyes of sauropsids are much better suited for color vision than even the best color vision in mammals. The best color vision in mammals is us. Well, humans and other derived primates. We have 3 types of color receptors plus black and white. And so by combining those 3 colors, the 3 color receptors and black and white, we can see a pretty big spectrum. You've probably been told at some point that animals see in black and white, where animals equals mammals, because that's what a lot of people think. And it's actually a lie. They don't see in black and white. They see in color, but they only got 2 color receptors. So they divide up the color spectrum less finely than we do. We, with 3, they're basically colorblind, like if any of you or if someone in your family who's got red-green colorblind, that gives a sense. People with red-green colorblind see colors, they just see less colors. They can distinguish them less well. That's what cats and dogs and so forth have. Humans and other derived primates, we've got 3 color receptors. We divided up much more. Sauropsids, 4. And this includes seeing into the ultraviolet, but also even in visible light. They're dividing it up far better than we can. So think about that. Waterproof skin, water-retaining kidneys, excellent daytime vision. Sauropsida is a group adapted to daylight. And indeed, when you go out at night, you typically aren't going to run into snakes or turtles or lizards. But during the daytime, at least during the warm daytime, you might. Even in the desert. And so the sauropsids were better at that kind of situation. So just as a reminder, we mammals are not reptiles nor descendants of reptiles. We are part of this larger group Synapsida, and in contrast, dinosaurs are part of this group Sauropsida, today represented by things like lizards, snakes, crocodilians, and birds, and turtles. Go turtles. So here we go, these traits. Aglandular skin, water-conserving kidneys, enhanced color vision. I show here Parareptilia as a distinct clade from Diapsida. Maybe not, but that's a 400 level class thing. We're not dealing with that here. So the reptiles were around. The sauropsids were around during the Permian. But by and large, they weren't significant. The therapsids were the dominant part of the community in terms of species diversity, in terms of ecological diversity. But to point out some of these Permian forms, they tend to be concentrated in this group Parareptilia. Some were sort of like chunky lizards. Sort of like less spiky versions of bearded dragons. They're not lizards. Lizards are diapsids. Here's that big armored guy that I kept on showing. Here it is. It's a big armored herbivore. There were aquatic forms. Mesosaurs were little, the first amniotes to really go back into the water for much of their life. We'll talk more about them when we talk about Mesozoic marine reptiles later on, even though they're not from the Mesozoic. Within Saropsida is a major clade. It's the clade that's still around today called Diapsida. This is the group with supra and infratemporal fenestrae. And this allowed them for a faster snapping bite. They have two sets of muscles to help close their jaws. Also, diapsids typically have longer hind limbs than front limbs. That scientist, Nick Houghton from the Smithsonian, said these guys have rear-wheel drive, as opposed to the front-wheel drive of therapsids. And like something with a really good rear-wheel drive, it's capable of popping a wheelie, that is, getting up on their hind legs when going really fast. And that's what they do. Many diapsids today, in this case, small crocodilians and lizards of various sizes. When threatened, when they really have to go somewhere, like this iguana that I guess was freaking out because I was taking this picture, they'll get up on their hind legs and run really fast. So, they can run on all fours, like that beauty there, but over here, its frilled lizard cousin is feeling it's in danger, so it's put out its frill is running, and then the sort of the basilisk on top can even run on water bipedally. So when they get into a desperate situation, they can go onto the hind legs and move really quickly for short periods of time. Now, not all diapsids can do that. There's one living group of diapsids that definitely can't run up on their hind legs. Those are turtles. And in fact, here is the skeleton of a Permian proto-turtle. The position of turtles has been rather contentious in the history of paleontology, but it does appear now that they are actually modified diapsids. No living turtle has a diapsid skull, so we used to think they were parareptiles, but no, they're diapsids. And you can see in this early form, its hind limbs are still bigger than its front legs. That's not true of most living turtles today. But it didn't yet have a shell. It did, however, have both supra and infratemporal fenestrae, showing it as a diapsid. And probably was a burrower. So here we have it, and again we have the big armored guys hanging around up above. And that's what the world is doing. A therapsid-dominated community throughout the second and third parts of the Permian. And then the greatest mass extinction in the history of life occurred. About 252 million years ago. Depending upon the way you count it, something like up to 95 or 96% of all species died. At least of marine animal organisms that fossilize. And so you think, okay, 4 to 5% of life survived. No, I said 95 to 96% of species died out. That doesn't mean 100% of the individuals of the surviving species survived. It was probably a small fraction of the population of each of those species that survived. Total mortality is probably something closer to 99% of fossilizing organisms as individuals. This is by far the worst mass extinction that's occurred since the origin of animals. Totally dwarfs the one at the end of the Cretaceous, which, as we will see at the end of the course, was still freaking bad. And as a result, the world before and after was radically different. Different enough that people made it one of the great boundaries in Earth history. The end of the Paleozoic, the beginning of the Mesozoic Era. Its cause is well known. It's a gigantic volcanic region that erupted in what's now Siberia. The deposits formed by them are called the Siberian traps. Traps doesn't mean something you get stuck in this context. Traps is from a Dutch word that's like steps, like stair steps. So called because when these rocks erode, they leave the sort of stair-step condition. It was a vast region that erupted and flowed out over a geologically short period of time. So much lava flowed out that if you took it to North America and spread it out evenly over North America, it would cover all of North America by about 410 feet. Or almost 400 feet. That's right, here we go. So a huge lava field. It erupted in less than 1 million years. And it released tremendous amounts of sulfides and greenhouse gases. So it's not the lava, other than for the local organisms of what became Siberia. It wasn't the lava that was the nasty stuff. It was the gases that came out with the eruption, which were truly significant. So here you can see the sort of extent of this stuff. It's a specific type of eruption called a flood basalt eruption. Basalt is a type of volcanic igneous rock. It's called a flood basalt because, first of all, it was very liquid lava. It flowed over a lot of area, and so much of it came out, it flooded a huge region. As it turns out, as this stuff was erupting, it was erupting through recently formed coal deposits and recently formed salt deposits, evaporite deposits. And so not only are the gases from the magma, or lava, coming out, also the coal seams have burst into flames, and they're throwing out carbon dioxide. And the salt is getting vaporized and producing hydrochloric acid. So recent estimates suggest as much as 170,000 gigatons of carbon, billions of tons of carbon released. To give you a sense of how much that is, if you took all the carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere today, that's 873 gigatons of carbon. And if you want to compare all the carbon that's been introduced by industrial activity by humans, that's 273 gigatons of carbon. So all the global warming we have experienced so far has been from a mere 273 gigaton release. This is 170,000. This is vastly worse than humans could ever possibly do, by orders of magnitude. And all that HCl is released. We're going to see the effects of those momentarily. But also sulfur gases are released. And in fact, it's that sulfur gases that have the first big effect, because they cause a cooling. We've seen that before. When Mount Pinatubo erupted back in the 90s, it caused a cooling by a couple degrees for the space of a year. This is something that drops global temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees for at least a decade and possibly longer. By comparison, the difference between now and the peak of the last ice age is about 7 degrees. So this is dropping at a deep freeze around the world. Not big enough to produce giant glacial sheets. There wasn't long enough time for that. But the equivalent cooling of a super intense ice age. But once those sulfurs clear, then all that greenhouse gas traps the heat in the Earth's atmosphere and produce the worst global warming the Earth has seen, at least since animals first appeared. How intense? At least an octupling of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You know, we're concerned about the amount of CO2 going up by the end of the century, double what it was before, or maybe triple. This is at least an octupling, possibly more. But wait, there's more than that. The extreme warming warms sea temperatures, which melts methane, which is trapped on the seafloor. There's a lot of methane trapped on the seafloor, which then bubbles up. Methane is a greenhouse gas. It's actually a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. And so this warming effect causes a positive feedback loop. And in nature, positive feedback loops you don't like. That's a snowballing effect. The net result, global temperatures seem to have averaged out at about 45 degrees C. That's 113 Fahrenheit. That's the average, equator to pole. For comparison, today's average temperature is 15.6 degrees C. Also, all that CO2 is mixing with this ocean water. And just like today, we have ocean acidification going on that's affecting reef-making organisms and shell-making organisms. Here is an incredibly intense period of ocean acidification. We also detect a tremendous drop in atmospheric oxygen levels. And that's because so many of the land plants and the phytoplankton are dying because of the extreme warming that nothing is photosynthesizing enough to produce oxygen. Or it's not sufficient oxygen. So this has been called when life nearly died. Now, to be fair, bacterial-grade life would have been perfectly fine. And many single-celled organisms. So, let's say when animals and plants nearly died, both on land and in the seas. And it was the end of one world, but the dawn of another better one. So here's Gorgonopsian. Gorgonopsians are this group of saber-toothed therapsids. Talking about the dread effects of this event. But it was actually only the halftime, because it was time for a new era to begin. And in my opinion, a better one. So, let's get over to what should have been actually today's lecture. That's okay. We've got some buffer built in for Wednesday. The Triassic transitions and the age of reptiles. So, yeah, I know it's the Mesozoic era, but I'm still writing Paleozoic era on my checks. So, so it's a new era now. It's the Mesozoic, the best era. That's my opinion. Some creatures like Listersaurus, the Dicynodont, look around. Where'd everyone go? And in fact, what happened, we have this huge devastation of ecosystems. Some groups of organisms fared better than others. Things with extremely low metabolic rates tended to do well. Things that were adapted to being in burrows or being semi-aquatic tended to do well, because those animals are used to dealing with low levels of oxygen and high levels of CO2 buildup. Yeah?
If what we were saying earlier, where the organisms were more built for like the daytime,
Right.
was it just like such an extreme circumstance of heat that it just didn't even matter?
Yeah. So some groups, by chance, happen to have adaptations that would be advantageous through this event, like the ability to retain water in the body and the ability to deal with stronger temperatures. And those were the sauropsids. And it is not for no reason the Mesozoic will become the age of reptiles. The sauropsids will take over. Now, in the early days of the Triassic, things are super, super low diversity. I mean, the nature field guides you would have, if you were in the early Triassic, would be very thin, the thinnest they've been since the colonization of land. But things actually do tend to do better. Actually, I've talked about this so far. I'm just going to skip on ahead. Yes, question?
So, to go off the extremely low diversity, isn't it sort of like a paleo mean that 50% of all land animals at some point in the Triassic were entirely just Listersaurus?
Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. With regard to the very low diversity, that picture was showing Listersaurus eating this one sort of plant called a quillwort. And like the vast majority of skeletons we find in the earliest Triassic in South Africa are Listersaurus itself. And the vast majority of plant fossils we find are this one group of primitive plant. So it was very, very low diversity. They recovered though. So in the aftermath, the therapsids remain present. The Dicynodonts, the Cynodonts, maybe a few others are hanging around. But it's by the middle Triassic, the sauropsids, especially the diapsids, become the dominant group. And so we think of it as an age of reptiles. So the first amniotes, the amniotic egg evolves down here. This was the age of synapsid dominance. And so we now make it into the Mesozoic, and so-called age of reptiles, better an age of diapsids, followed by the current age of mammals. So here's the early Triassic world. All the land still pretty much as Pangea, centered on the equator. Earliest days, we still had some big therapsid predators. Synapses there, about the size of a leopard. And a big dicynodont, on the size of, a cow. But during this time, we get lots of weird types of reptiles evolving in diapsids. So we have tree-dwelling monkey lizards, as they've been called, sort of taking that niche that had previously been occupied by some of those dicynodont relatives. We have big, well, not that big, meter to 2 meter long herbivores on land. We get the marine diapsids showing up, going back into the water and eating fish or eating shellfish. And we get turtles. Okay, turtles aren't quite turtles yet, but that's an early turtle. Or I say proto-turtle. But a particularly important radiation among the diapsids is a group called the Archosauriforms. Archosaur means ruling reptile. Archos, or archon, like monarchy, or oligarchy, patriarchy, so ruling, so the ruling reptiles. There were Archosauriforms right before the end of the Permian. There were some semi-aquatic forms. But they only really become common in the early Triassic. But they do become common in the early Triassic. Many of the early ones are either fish eaters, like these guys over here, or meat eaters, actual flesh eaters, like the guys on this side. Some of these are quite small, some are larger. And in the earliest days of the Triassic, they're living side by side with important therapsids. Now, what makes an Archosauriform an Archosauriform? Well, among other traits, is they've got an antorbital fenestra and a mandibular fenestra. Hey, we've seen those things before when we talked about dinosaur osteology. So, spoiler alert, dinosaurs are Archosauriforms. Now, what do these structures actually mean? What do these open holes in their heads mean? The mandibular fenestra, down here, is a jaw muscle opening for the lower jaw. It's sort of the equivalent to the temporal fenestrae. It allows for very powerful lower jaw muscles. But the antorbital fenestra is for a sinus, an air sac. Now, we'll talk later on about some of the functions of that air sac when we talk about physiology. One thing it would do would just lighten up the head so they can move their heads more quickly. But that's probably a side effect. It may be involved in thermoregulation, in keeping the ability to keep the head cooler than it might otherwise be. And that's important because, you got a brain in your head. Even the Archosauriforms have brains in their heads. And brains can't get uncooked. It's very important to make sure your brain doesn't get too hot. You can't uncook a brain. Now, in most primitive tetrapods, there's the form of respiration called rib breathing. So you breathe by expanding and contracting your rib cage. Other groups retain that, but add something else. Now, one aspect of this is if you move by walking from side to side, by land swimming, basically, you're compressing those rib cages, and in fact, you're using the muscles that otherwise you would use to breathe when you're moving. So it is difficult to simultaneously breathe and move. And so many primitive tetrapods don't. They'll move, and then they'll breathe. Which is why lizards, which are faster than you are, if you ever try to catch a lizard, you'll find it out, but they can't run for very long. They can't have sustained motion. Archosauriforms tend to have this what's called the semi-improved stance. Not the sprawling stance, but something like this. Or in some cases, all the way to C, we'll see that, which allows them to move without so much side-to-side motion. And so they can keep on breathing while moving. And therefore they can move for much more extended periods of time. Don't worry about memorizing this. You're not going to memorize this. But this is available on the lecture notes. This is a family tree showing the derived group of Archosauria, which is a subdivision of Archosauriforms. Archosauria is still with us today in the form of birds and crocodilians. And as we can see in here, dinosaurs are part of Archosauria, way up here. We'll deal with them on Wednesday, and of course later on. But there's another branch in Archosauria, which is this one, the sort of inappropriately named pseudosuchia, or false crocodiles. Why is it inappropriate? Because crocodiles are the living part of pseudosuchia. So, and in fact, there's a group, Suchia, which is part of pseudosuchia. So the Suchians are part of the non-Suchians. It's not my fault I didn't name these things. They're just words. And it's the pseudosuchian group, which turns out to be the dominant group in the Triassic. Hence the reason I played Crocodile Rock. Now, modern Archosaurs have a number of skeletal adaptations in common. We'll see some of those in a bit. But they also have behavioral traits that are shared in common. Unlike lizards, snakes, turtles, and mammals, at least ancestrally, Archosaurs tend to make nests out of vegetation. All those other groups tend to make their nests to lay their eggs by digging holes. Because remember, primitive mammals today still lay eggs. In Archosaurs, they might dig somewhat of a hole, but they'll line it with vegetation. Also, unlike most lizards, snakes, turtles, the crocodilians and the birds have what we call parental nest attendants. At least one parent hangs around the nest to protect it. And indeed, not only while the eggs are developing, but all the way up till after they hatch. And in fact, they communicate with the young right before they hatch. The babies make sounds from inside the nest, even before the egg has cracked. And the parents make sounds back. And in the case of crocodilians, they'll uncover the nest. The parents will continue to watch after the young, even for several weeks. Now, everyone knows that about birds, but crocodilians do that too. So here's a daddy gharial, which is a long-snouted South Asian crocodilian, with a bunch of his babies on his head. They even provision their young. That is, they bring food to their young. For a long time, we weren't aware that crocodilians do it, but it's now been documented. And of course, we've all known that birds feed their young, and as you can see, this blackbird clearly favors one of its offspring over the other. But it will eventually feed the other one. And I mentioned the communication before between the parents and the babies. That's another attribute of Archosaurs, complex vocal communication. Turtles, pretty much silent. Snakes, they hiss, some rattle. Lizards, pretty much silent. I am not kept awake, or kept awake during the day, by my bearded dragons making noises. In fact, geckos make noises, and geckos are famous for making noises, and that's where they get their name, which is the sound they make, or the approximation thereof. So, what was the Tangled? The chameleon in Tangled, they haven't made noise because Hollywood abhors the fact that there are silent animals. They cannot handle the fact that many types of animals do not communicate vocally. And so they force them to make noises. They don't make noises. Crocodilians, lots of different noises. Baby to baby, baby to adult to adult, for threatening, for courtship, whatever. And of course, we all know that birds make lots and lots and lots of noises. Now, these are all derived traits shared by two closest living relatives. None of these are fossilizable. Well, maybe the nest. We'll talk about that in the third section of the course. But we can infer that the common ancestor of both had these traits and passed it on to their descendants. Now, something that has been hypothesized is that Archosaurs, and indeed Archosauriforms, had a specialized form of respiration. Now, both crocodilians and birds have a specialized form of respiration, but it's been highly modified in both groups, neither of which show what the ancestral state was. But due to a lot of work, it appears that early Archosaurs, and as it turns out, non-bird dinosaurs, made a lot of use of their gastralia in respiration. Remember gastralia, the belly ribs? I said I was going to talk about a function for them. I'm talking about a function for them. In Archosaurs, unlike other tetrapods, the connections of the gastralia are sort of a zigzag down the middle. Each gastralium contacts two gastralia on the other side. And there's a sheet of muscles that run from the pelvic region forward. When that contracts, it would pull on these and pull these, the gastral basket, the gastralia, down, and then relax it, it would snap back up. And that helps pump air through the lungs. And that's a set of muscles that's not used, in locomotion. So it's another way to keep on pumping oxygen into your lungs when you're moving. Yeah.
This is like a bony diaphragm.
What's that?
Isn't this kind of like a bony diaphragm?
It is analogous to a diaphragm at 90 degrees off of it.
Right.
So the diaphragm is moving this way, this is going, but you're exactly right. It is functionally the equivalent. Exactly. Now, in some of the older literature about the Triassic, they tended to talk about how the therapsids were dominant in the early Triassic, and then there was this gradual transition to Archosaur dominance. So we see in white are the therapsids, in black are the Archosaurs, and it's portrayed as if it's a slow transition. So here we have the early Triassic represented by 2 chunks at a time, the middle Triassic by an equivalent chunk, the late Triassic. Okay, now let's scale it to time. And in fact, I drew that triangle way too big. That triangle should terminate about here. Because the early Triassic is about 6.5 weeks. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but it's only a few million years. Remember, when people chopped up geologic time, they didn't do so based on numerical time. And subsequently, we got the radiometric dates. The early Triassic is only a couple million years out of 50 million years. So there was not a long transition. The time the synapsids were important in the Triassic was simply the recovery phase. And once life had reestablished, the Archosaurs displaced them. Now, within the Archosaurs, we see 2 major types of ankles. I mentioned before I would actually give names. Well, I'm not giving names. I would introduce the names of 2 of the tarsals, the 2 proximal tarsals, the ones closest to the shin. And these are collectively the astragalus and the calcaneum. In our case, we can feel the calcaneum. It includes the bone that we feel that's our heel. In living crocodiles, the relationship between the astragalus and the calcaneum is what we see on the left, called the crurotarsal, which is crossing the tarsal joint. The astragalus is connected to the shin, and it's got a pivot point with the calcaneum and the foot. And the calcaneum is attached to the foot. So the pivot point in the ankle is within the ankle. And in fact, convergent on us mammals, the crocodilian lineage actually evolves a heel. They actually have a projection backwards. The bird condition, which we'll see the dinosaurs had, is what's called the mesotarsal joint, where the astragalus and the calcaneum are attached to the shin, and it's a super simple hinge inside the foot. So the foot is just flapping up and down. Not doing a lot of other motion, just flapping up and down in the foot, within the ankle. So crurotarsal, mesotarsal. Crossing the ankle and middle of the ankle is what those terms mean. So here we see some crurotarsal joints in pseudotsuchians, a modern alligator, and an extinct Triassic form. And we can even see they've got heels. So heel-based ankle joint. And in dinosaurs and their cousins, there's just a simple hinge-based ankle joint. Remember when I talked about evolution is not from simple to complex? Sometimes it goes from complex to simple. Here's a great case of it. The dinosaur lineage has simplified it down to a simple hinge. In the Triassic, both the dinosaur lineage, the dinosaur bird lineage, and the crocodile lineage are present. But throughout most of the Triassic, it's the crocodile lineage that's the ecological dominant one. So this is life in the petrified forest before it was petrified. So the third radiation, the first radiation of the Triassic is the pseudotsuchian radiation. So Redondosaurus here is a pseudotsuchian, probably. Whereas Placerius there, that is a therapsid. It's a dicynodont therapsid about to get munched. So the pseudotsuchia is crocodilians and everything closer to them than to birds. And they include things like big predators. You can see that meter scale there. They include crocodile mimics, or we should say that crocodiles are mimicking them, because the crocodiles haven't quite evolved this body form. Armored quadrupedal herbivores. We'll see that pattern show up. And indeed, if you looked at different communities of organisms in the Triassic, these are a succession of communities in the petrified forest, we would find that the amniotes were dominated by pseudoseuchians, the ones in red. The ones in orange are non-Archosaur, Archosauriforms, don't worry too much about it. The ones in green are the Dinosaur lineage. And you see they're a much smaller part of the fauna in terms of the species, and smaller individuals in terms of the animals. And then we also have some things like, there's a therapsid over here, and we've got, other types of sauropsids, we've got amphibians, and so forth. I'll show you that picture. It's a cool picture. So, in the Triassic, it's the pseudoseuchians, which are ecologically dominant, followed by, in some communities, therapsids. And then the other archosaurs follow up. So in a middle Triassic world, we get a world dominated by pseudoseuchian archosaurs, again with therapsids, omnivores, and herbivores, as I just showed in the previous picture. Here we see such a community. And it's in this world that we begin to see the rise of the dinosaur lineage. Now, the lineage that includes dinosaurs is called Ornithodyra. And they evolved in the shadow of the pseudoseuchians, and for that matter, in the shadow of the therapsids. They started off as small-bodied forms. We can see here, Scleromachus, 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters is not even an inch. 2.54 centimeters is exactly 1 inch. Ornithodyra is a sister group to the pseudoseuchians. Okay, technically, for those people who are watching this, Ava metatarsalia is technically the pseudo. We're not going to care about that distinction. So are Aphanosaurs. The earliest ones, though, are actually only known from footprints. But think about that. That distinction between the foot style, that means you can recognize a pseudoseuchian track from an Ornithodyran track pretty well. There are 2 major branches in Ornithodyra. Pterosauromorpha, those are pterosaurs and their Triassic kin. And Dinosauromorpha, which not surprisingly is dinosaurs and their Triassic kin. So what makes an Ornithodyran an Ornithodyran? We'll wrap up with that attribute. We're actually almost caught up. So by the way, here's a pterosaur. We'll talk more about pterosaurs later on, the flying reptiles. Ornithodyrans, the word means bird neck. And that's because the shape of their cervical vertebrae is very distinctive from the shape of their dorsal vertebrae. So they can fold their neck back up into an S. As you see modern birds do. Now the primitive members of Ornithodyra all look pretty similar. They've been nicknamed the bunny crocs after Lagasuchus, which is one of the representatives there, which means bunny croc. Okay, they didn't look like this. And so we'll wrap up with this slide here. Cervicals distinct from the dorsals, so we've seen that. Also, in Ornithodyra we get the parasagittal posture. Owen noticed it before. What's that? That's legs directly underneath the body. Also, digitigrade stance. I'll pick up next time with what digitigrade stance is, but it's standing on the balls of your feet. And elongate, stretched out metatarsals. These are little guys to start off with, and yet from these little guys, great things will come. So next time we'll pick up with the beginnings of Ornithodyran diversification, culminating in dinosaurs, because in Wednesday we finally have the rise of Dinosauria.